Every video game is a product of its time. They usually reflect what kind of technology was available at the time and what people wanted to play around that time. However, time waits for no man, and sooner or later, a game is going to age, whether it be in terms of graphical fidelity, certain mechanics, etc. That's where the remake comes in. Somebody at some game company will get the idea to take an old game from the past and remake it for a modern audience. This, however, comes with complications. If the game in question was a game a lot of people love, the remake has a lot to live up to. And depending on what the remake does, regardless of how loved the original game was, it can either be something that surpasses the original in every way, or a mess that actively shames the original. Naturally, people have all sorts of opinions on remakes, and in more recent times, we've gotten more than our fair share of them. Not every remake is received all that well, of course. For every Shadow of the Colossus, we get a GTA trilogy. And then there's me. I found myself in a weird spot when it comes to remakes. That's not to say I don't like remakes. Heck, I love it when an old game gets remade for a modern audience, especially when it's a game that I have at least some interest in. The weird thing comes from the fact that my opinions on certain remakes tend to differ from the crowd. There's a surprising amount of remakes that are generally seen as mediocre or even bad. Meanwhile, I'm over here getting some unironic enjoyment out of them. And today, I want to go over 5 such remakes. Basically, this is somewhat of an unpopular opinions video, which hey, if you want to see more of, give the video 150 likes and I'll try to fit such a video into my ever-changing upload schedule. Hopefully you guys will want to see that, because I got some whoppers. Also, just as a precaution, the video title is somewhat of an exaggeration. I'm sure someone out there agrees with me. These are just remakes that seem to get mostly mediocre to negative responses from the people who play them. And hey, if you agree or disagree with any of my takes, leave a comment sharing your own thoughts. I'll gladly listen to both sides. But before we get into the 5 remakes that I wish to talk about, we need to ask an important question. What is a remake? I know that sounds like a dumb question, but in more recent times, the term has become a lot more stretched. By that I mean so many games that come out with the remake label, yet they're also vastly different from one another. As one example, the Crash, Insane, and Spyro Reignited trilogies call themselves remakes of the original 3 Crash and Spyro games. They have updated graphics and some minor enhancements, but are by and large the original games. These tend to be labeled as more remasters than remakes, but I feel like Crash and Spyro do just enough to be considered remakes. Then on the other side of the spectrum, we get remakes like Resident Evil 2 and Final Fantasy VII. These games claim to be remakes of the original games, but aside from the name, characters, and general locations, they're wildly different experiences compared to the original. That doesn't make them bad by any means, but they definitely feel less like remakes per se, and more so reimaginings. And as if that weren't weird enough, we also have remakes that walk the line between the 2 examples I brought up. Examples of such would be the recent Dead Space remake and Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe. These 2 appear to be the same games as the originals, just with some modern graphics and quality of life updates, but they also add new story content that builds on the existing story from the original game. How Dead Space in particular flat out changes certain sequences from the original, and all for the better it seems. So now you probably see why I felt the need to ask that question. At this point, there's at least 3 different types of remakes, and we're going to be seeing all 3 in this video. With that said, let's kick things off with a bit of an infamous one. Conquer Live and Reloaded. Conker's Bad Fur Day is a cult classic for many people. It's a raunchy parody of typical cartoony platformers where every character that would normally be all kid-friendly is now profane and adult. It's one of Rareware's most famous and some consider best games, and after Microsoft bought Rareware, they released a remake of it for the original Xbox titled Conquer Live and Reloaded. The response to said remake at the time was mixed, to say the least. While some did say it was better, the fans weren't all that happy with it. I, however, believe it to be the definitive version of Conker's Bad Fur Day, and let me explain why. For one, the game is just plain gorgeous. Bad Fur Day was already a pretty good-looking N64 game, but Live and Reloaded is so much prettier. This was an original Xbox game. A late Xbox game, I'll grant you, but still, this is easily on par with the Crash Bandicoot Insane trilogy. For 2, there are some legitimate improvements to the gameplay. The frying pan from the original is swapped out for a bat that you could strafe while using rather than stopping on a dime every time you pull it out. You have an aiming reticle for all projectile weapons rather than just eyeballing it in the original. Several sections were made easier in one way or another, such as moving this bunch of bees all the way from up here to down here, reducing the amount of times you need to hit the cow in the bull section, and the amount of sweet corn you need in Pooh Mountain. Oh, and you know It's War, the one part of the game that everybody hates due to the bad gun controls and the stupid beach? Well, it's actually fun now thanks to good old dual-stick gaming for the guns and letting you use your normal guns for the beach rather than a clunky rocket launcher, paving over a massive difficulty spike. There are other smaller things too, like a longer air meter for the underwater sections, actual enemies sprinkled throughout for you to fight, cleaner audio that doesn't sound like it's coming from a potato.
What the damn diddly squat are you doing in my barn?
Well, I never. It's a talking pitchfork.
What the damn diddly squat are you doing in my barn?
Well, I never. It's a talking pitchfork.
And remixed music that uses real instruments. By now I'm sure you're wondering, if they made all these improvements, why was it received so poorly? I'll tell you why. Because certain swear words that were uncensored in the original are censored in the remake. Yes, there are seriously people who will disregard all the improvements made just because of the censorship. They believe that just because the swear words are censored, they're not funny, which Family Guy would like to speak to you about.
Guys, this is driving me nuts. Was one of the dwarves named Snappy? Kind of well-dressed, or am I just making that up?
There are very few actual truths to what is and isn't funny since comedy is largely subjective, but there is one thing that is nearly universally agreed upon. Swear words, on their own, are not funny. We live in an age where more and more adult media believes that simply having the characters swear a bunch leads to funny moments, when it's really the context surrounding the swear words that makes them funny. There are several examples of this done well and equal amounts not. Hell, even the original game knew this, since there were a couple moments where the swear words were censored, and last I checked, those were still considered funny. Not to mention, this is the only part of the game that was censored. Everything else about the game remains intact, and certain scenes were made even bloodier and gorier than the original. So with all that said, I really think we need to ask ourselves, is the censorship really that bad when A, virtually everything else about the game was improved, B, the censorship is honestly so poor that you could still make out what they're saying, and C, the original censored some words to begin with. If you have issues with the remake outside the censorship, that's one thing, but the censorship alone really isn't that valid of a reason anymore. Fortunately, this is one case where I know I'm not alone in this, since quite a few people have looked back on both the original and the remake with fresh eyes, and come to see the banes and boons of both. That's not to say that you should like one over the other, that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to make it clear why I prefer one over the other, and why I find certain criticisms of this and the other 4 remakes in this video unfounded. I hope I made that clear. With that out of the way, let's move on to the second remake of the video, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask 3D. One of the most popular games on the 3DS was and still is The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D, a remake of Ocarina of Time that basically took everything bad about the original and fixed it while giving it a fresh coat of paint. It was welcomed with open arms and loved by all. So what happened with Majora's Mask? It's not like people don't love it. Majora's Mask is a weird but beloved N64 game. So why did the 3DS remake fail when Ocarina succeeded? To be honest, I don't know why. It uses the same graphics as Ocarina 3D, which is pretty fitting given that the original Majora's Mask used the same assets as the original Ocarina, and it's a beautiful 3DS game. Like, the N64 original didn't look bad for a late N64 game, but the 3DS remake looks so much better. Many of the assets from Ocarina 3D translate beautifully to Majora 3D, and the new ones they made specifically for this game are clear upgrades from their N64 counterparts in my opinion. In fact, I don't understand how people prefer the original graphics. Like, as an example, just look at the makeover the moon got in the remake. Are you really gonna tell me that this looks scarier than this? If so, you probably get scared by Elmo. Actually, you know what? Bad example. What isn't a bad example is the performance across both versions. Like, I know Majora's Mask is an N64 game, but good golly, the frame rate is bad. Like, you get 20 FPS from this game on a good day, and 5 FPS if you happen to catch it while drunk. The remake, meanwhile, gives you a stable 30 FPS throughout, which makes for a much more pleasant experience. Your mileage may vary in this case, but for me, performance is a major factor to whether or not I can appreciate a game. You can have the most beautiful graphics of your generation, but if it only works at like 15 FPS at most, I'm not going to be able to appreciate them, let alone enjoy playing your game. In the case of Majora, while I might be able to stomach the original's performance, I'd rather play the remake instead. Another thing people complain about is the lack of freedom. What lack of freedom? Sure, the boss is a more obvious solution in this version, but isn't that the case for every Zelda game ever? Maybe not Breath of the Wild per se, but that entire game relies on freedom. 99% of Zelda games involving you using a recently required item to at least stun the boss for you to attack. Any Zelda fan who's played at least 3 of these games would naturally have that mindset. Besides, Odawa still gives you the option to stun it however you can. Hell, in my first playthrough, I kept chucking bombs at it until it dropped. Twin Mode and Go are far more scripted, sure, but they were like that in the original. Plus, in Twin Mode's case, I like that the Giant's Mask is treated like the other masks that gave you power-ups rather than just Big Link. The only one that's really an issue is Georg, but at least the remake actually gives you a clearer plan of attack. It's time consuming, but that only becomes a problem if you're prone to panicking, and forget that you can slow down time beforehand. There are other things like Zora Link's swimming being nerfed and only being able to freeze certain parts of the water with your ice arrows, but I feel like these things are at worst minor annoyances. The latter is a little hand-holdy, but to say that these small things ruin the entire experience is an exaggeration, plain and simple, especially when the rest of the game is still very much Majora's Mask with the improvements that Ocarina 3D implemented. The story and characters are still wonderful, and I get genuine emotion out of helping these people. The original works just fine, but the remake is a genuine improvement in my book. Unfortunately, this is one remake that I don't see getting any recognition anytime soon. Maybe I haven't looked in the right places yet, but to this day, quite a few people still seem to look down on this remake while ignoring all its positives. I doubt this video will do anything to rectify that, but one can only hope that someday someone else will give this game a fair shake. In any case, it's time to move on to the next remake that might actually be more controversial than the prior two, and that would be Mario & Luigi Bowser's Inside Story 3DS. Despite the launch of the Switch, Nintendo still continued to support the 3DS up until 2020. Several of the games released for the handheld around the time ended up being remakes of older games. Some good, some not. 2 in particular were remakes of Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga and Mario & Luigi Bowser's Inside Story. The former was welcomed with open arms and was widely regarded as a far superior game over the GBA original. The latter... well, it's in this video, do I need to say more? This is one remake that I kinda understand the criticism for, but also disagree heavily with. For one, and you probably saw this coming, the graphics are beautiful. Sure, it's more of Dream Team's art style, but they make the most of it by making the whole game gorgeous. If you guys recall, I've mentioned in the past that I don't care for the art style of the DS Mario & Luigi games. I tolerated it in Partners in Time because the game was just that good, and because it was my only option. But with Bowser's Inside Story, not only do I have a better looking version, but I also don't find the original game that appealing either. Like, by DS standards it looks pretty good, but the 3DS breathes so much more new life into it. There is, however, one big criticism about the graphics that I do understand. The remake only runs at 30 FPS when the original ran at 60. I can't really blame the hardware or graphics for this one, since Superstar 3DS ran at 60 FPS on the same handheld with the same graphics, so this is more of an optimization issue. I'm sure if the developers were given more time, they would be able to make this game run at 60, yet I don't see this as the big deal everyone else does. Don't get me wrong, I'm someone who will always prefer 60 FPS, especially nowadays where it's practically required, but I'm not wholly against 30 FPS either as long as it's consistent, which it is for the most part. There are drops in the giant battles, but I can forgive that because stuff like that would naturally push the handheld pretty far. Another huge complaint is the fact that the remake is easier than the original. And that's stupid. You guys are acting like the remake is the easiest thing in the world now, like OG Superstar Saga, when it really isn't. In fact, it's quite challenging at multiple points, especially towards the end. Besides, there are some legitimate improvements here, such as not mashing the buttons every time you want to flee, skippable tutorials, new deeply sinister music tracks for Dark Falfo and Dark Star, and no more blowing into the mic to breathe fire in the giant battles. That last one is especially warranted given how many times fire breath is needed for certain battles. Really, the only thing I legitimately don't like about this game is the side story Bowser Jr.'s journey. The story is pretty good, but the gameplay is terrible. Thankfully, I can choose to ignore that and still get the intended experience. And just because I know somebody's gonna bring this up in the comment section, yes, I'm well aware of the fact that this game's sales are the cause of Alpha Dream going under. Heck, I've even met people who use that very reason to call it not only inferior, but also the worst Mario & Luigi game ever made. And my only response to that is,
whoa! That's interesting, but I sure don't care.
Look, guys, unless it's something really, really bad, like with Activision where it's obvious that every higher-up is a demon in disguise, I do not, under any circumstances, let behind-the-scenes drama hinder my experience with a video game. I'm well aware of the woke activists on Twitter who are practically trying to murder anyone that plays Hogwarts Legacy, and I still want to play the game someday. Point is, if I want to enjoy a video game, I'm gonna enjoy a fucking video game. And nobody has any right to say I can't just because of some behind-the-scenes stuff that does not affect the actual quality of the game. Almost went off on a tangent there. Sorry, it's just things like that get me heated and I need to vent a bit. Regardless, I doubt anyone will give Bowser's Inside Story DX a chance anytime soon. The wounds from AlphaTrine's bankruptcy still haven't healed after almost 5 years, holy shit. And even though I don't count that as a factor in my enjoyment, a lot of people do. It's sad because I don't think a game like this deserved it. But the world is sometimes a cruel place. In any case, let's move on to remake number 4. That being Resident Evil 3. After the success of Resident Evil 7, Capcom had 2 teams of developers remake Resident Evil 2 and 3 for a modern audience. Resident Evil 2 was subject to critical acclaim as a brilliant reimagining of the 1998 classic. Resident Evil 3 was a lot more mixed. While there was some positive reception, the general consensus was that it was just okay, with some even calling it outright bad. Personally, I love it quite a bit. The game is gorgeous, Nemesis is ultra terrifying and looks amazing, unless you're Manga Kamen who's still turned off by the fact that he has a nose. You can actually dodge in this version, and Jill and Carlos have way better chemistry than the original thanks to a much more lovable Carlos and good voice acting from both.
Hey, are you okay?
Yes. Barely. What's going on?
No way! That monster just doesn't give up!
What? I thought we killed that thing!
No.
I know there's the major complaints of them scrapping the live selection choices and certain areas from the original, but I don't find either of those really as bad as people make them out to be. To tackle the first one, those live selection choices don't really matter. They don't change how the story goes, and you only get special items from a couple of them. 95% of the choices just amount to, do you want to enter this way or that way, until the end where suddenly your choices do matter because of the infamous Barry ending. Whoop-de-doo. Look, all I'm saying is, if you're gonna give me choices throughout a game, I expect them to actually mean something, you know? Like, I don't expect some big, grand morality system like Mass Effect or Undertale, but unless you make a point of your choices not mattering like in Deltarune, why bother giving me the option to pick one choice or another if they're largely inconsequential to the story? As for the other one, I do understand where they're coming from regarding cut content, but I also find the severity of the complaint hypocritical. Mainly because RE2 Remake also cut some content from the original, and hardly anyone treats it as a big problem. I know the popular response is, oh, well, it wasn't as bad as in RE2 Remake as it is in RE3 Remake. But that's not true. If anything, it's actually worse in 2 Remake. You know the A-B scenarios in the original? You know how each scenario had its own content for both Leon and Claire? Well, in the remake, none of that is the case. Both scenarios play out exactly the same regardless of which character you choose. That's a whopping 50% of the original game that was cut. A literal half that was thrown in the garbage. And yet, barely anyone I've seen consider this as bad as it is, while simultaneously criticizing RE3 Remake for cutting less content. Our biases truly speak volumes, don't they? Now, none of this is to say that RE2 Make is a worse game because of the cut content. Hell no, RE2 Make is still a really great game. What I'm trying to say is, if you're gonna criticize one remake for cutting content, you should at least be fair and criticize the other remake for also cutting content. Plus, certain areas like the RPD straight up didn't make sense in the original. The game expects you to believe that while Leon and Claire were being chased by Mr. X, Jill was also in the RPD being chased by Nemesis. There's no way that the RPD is big enough to have that many characters running around without encountering each other at least once. And yet they don't, which doesn't make any sense at all. So if anything, I'm glad that got swapped out for Carlos time. Sadly, I don't see this remake getting any more love anytime soon, as most RE fans' opinions on it are pretty set in stone. But I would appreciate it if people did give this game another look, because RE3 Remake is a good game at its core. I just feel that a lot of it is misunderstood. And with that, we are moving on to the final remake of the day, and one that's actually seen a bit more positivity compared to when it first released. SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated. I know what you're thinking. Wait, isn't this more of a remaster than a remake? Well, this one's more in line with the Crash and Spyro remakes, where it's virtually the same game with minor tweaks and modern graphics. It counts. SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom is another cult classic that many consider to be the best SpongeBob game ever made. And in the recent remake craze gaming is going through, THQ Nordic noticed this and had Purple Lamp remake Battle for Bikini Bottom. The reception at launch was rather lukewarm, with only a handful of people giving it any praise. Much like Conquer Live and Reloaded, I don't understand any of the hate this remake got when it launched. Like, come on, this is pretty much the same game as the original, but just made better. It's positively gorgeous, with several tweaks to the gameplay that make it better. SpongeBob is a lot more fun to use, there are several new character animations when talking to NPCs, you can actually see what you're doing in Kelp Forest, and Patrick's throwing ability was made to auto-target. There was the complaint of the new graphics not feeling like the game's underwater, but to be blunt, that complaint's stupid. Not liking the new graphics is one thing, but to say that this looks less underwater than this is a dumb thing to say in my book. Literally, the only things that I genuinely consider problems with this game are not getting Clancy Brown to reprise his role as Mr. Krabs, which didn't bother me too much, I got used to it pretty quick. The Robot Patrick fight looks significantly less intimidating than the original, and the audio for 2 of the final cutscenes of the game is out of sync. I would have also brought out the added multiplayer, but come on, no one plays this game for the multiplayer, you can easily ignore it. Other than that, this remake got way more hate than it deserved. Maybe it came out of a lot of people's nostalgia for the original, but either way, the hate for this game was largely undeserved in my opinion. Fortunately, this last remake does come with a happy ending. With the release of SpongeBob the Cosmic Shake, several people have gone back to Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated and given it way more love than it initially received at launch. It seems they realized that their heads were in the sand back then and gave the game a fair shake, which on one hand might disqualify it for a video like this, but given the reception at launch, I'd say it still warrants a discussion. With that said, those are 5 remakes that I like but nobody else does. Even though me feeling this way about certain games does make me feel somewhat isolated from people, it also gives me more to talk about on my channel. I mean, YouTube is practically a central hub for talking about opinions, and who doesn't love the occasional unpopular opinion video? Let me know what you thought of this video. Did you agree with me on any of the things I said? Do you feel like chewing me out because I like something you vitriolically hate? And do you want to see a more general unpopular opinions video in the future? I'd love to hear at least 2 of those in the comments. As for next time, since there's a special remake on the horizon that's got the entire gaming world holding their breath, as well as a new video game movie that's also got everyone holding their breath, the next video will be discussing either one or the other. RE4 Remake is coming out first, so if I can finish that before the Mario movie comes out, that video might come first. But given how close it is to the Mario movie, there's a good chance that my review of that will come first. Only the future will tell that tale, and I hope you guys look forward to both videos. See you next time, everybody!